Welcome to This Week in Perspective with me, Adam Simbeye. The 29th Ordinary Session of the African Union Heads of State convened in Addis Ababa, opened in Addis Ababa with a renewed hope for a bright future and reforms with the theme harnessing the demographic dividend through investment in the youth. The heads of state reviewed a number of issues and decisions made in the previous summits, at least the 28th summit, such as the work undertaken by the Commission since taking the office, the report of President Kagame's Commission on Institutional Reforms of the AU, peace and security, and partnership between the UN and the AU, where some of those issues were focused, but there were many others. So let's see, to discuss this with me today, on my right is Richard Mbunda from the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, University of Dar es Salaam. He's participating for the first time. So Richard, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Next, a veteran of the program, Professor Daudi Mukangara, again from the University of Dar es Salaam, the same Department of Political Science and Public Administration. And on my left, of course, another veteran, Professor Maxim Muya, from the same department, Political Science and Public Administration. You will wonder, viewers, why you have three panelists here from the same university, but is this the only university in Tanzania? There are many others, but it is easier to get them than to get others from other universities. The last but not least, Bravias Kahuyoza from Kampala International University, also a veteran on the program. He has appeared here several times. So, gentlemen, welcome. Today, I don't even need to mention the concern of gender imbalance. Let's leave it as it is. So, let's hope that in the next 55 minutes, you four panelists will be able to discuss, if possible, analyze the 29th summit of the heads of state in the AU. So I will launch the first question, and I would like to ask Professor Mukangara to respond to this. In your view, the four of you, was the 29th Ordinary Session of the AU heads of state in Addis Ababa early this month more productive this time around, assuming that the 28th in January was not, and what were the major issues under discussion or consideration? Professor Mukangara.
Well, first of all, on the question of whether this particular session was more productive, I think, as you have hinted yourself, you got to compare it with something else. I would hesitate to make a conclusion on that, because I think there have been other sessions. The AU has been around since 2002, and I'm sure they have had other sessions in which they had many extremely important resolutions in my interest. For example, some sessions in 2007, 2008 about the industrialization of Africa. So it is difficult to say whether this was more productive or not. However, on one particular point, I think it may be the case, namely that after a long time, this particular session was discussing reform, and it was discussing a report which had recommendations on the reform of the AU. And I think that is quite significant. My colleagues may correct me. I don't know whether there was any other major undertaking or a study of reform in the AU life. There were several others, some of them probably more important during the life of the OAU. The predecessor of the AU, but I think that perhaps with the AU, this is the first significant time that they have had a reform headed by a head of state. I must hasten to add, of course, that there was another one in 2007, if I may recall, which is probably the basis for this particular report of the of Kagame. In 2007, they actually undertook to review the entire AU. And a panel of eminent persons was formed. And 6 months later, it presented its report, which was not decided upon. In January, that is, of 2008. The review actually came out in 2000, well, the terms of reference for review came out in 2007. So in January, they were ready, they presented the report, no action was taken, and then they went to Egypt at Sharm el-Sheikh in 2008. It was supposed to be discussed there. It was not discussed. It was postponed until January 2009 and so on. And this, eventually in 2009, they formed another committee, this time of heads of state. I don't know what became of that particular committee. So perhaps it was this, some kind of revival to have this
or maybe they wanted to give
report.
it more teeth.
Yep.
By having the heads of state themselves sit down and discuss this.
Yeah, the others will help me. But the most important thing about this particular session that has just gone by is this, that they were discussing this particular report on the reform of the AU.
Professor Marx.
I'm not conversant on the subject area, but I have taken consideration of a number of activities that have been laid upon by states in Africa and elsewhere, because there are certain things which one can derive from what other people have done. And to me, it was kind of annoying that the African countries were so curious about it and more interested in coming together, when in actual fact, in contrast, the European countries had been traveling at that time. And to me, it was a mess. These guys, they created things for together, and now they are splitting. So what's going to happen to them, and by extension, to those that thought that cooperation was something useful? My colleague Daudi Mukangara loves this subject of knowledge in our department, IR. Some of us, they're saying, well, let us look further into it, whether there's anything. If those people that came out first and came out with institution practices and actors, particularly on this particular line of action, only to find that after a while they say, okay, let us reflect it further. Let us reflect it by going away from one another. I hated that. Daudi should be able to explain this, otherwise we'll fight in the hall in our department, because here is a clear example that coming together probably may not be that positive from the experiences of those that were in front of us.
I mean, the experience of the European Union with Brexit?
Is it the European Union alone?
No.
I am looking at other countries as well, the way they are looking at in those countries.
Maybe you mentioned them.
Daudi mentioned them to give your own, punishment. Is it worthwhile? Is it worthwhile from what some of us know, that this thing was just for colonial arrangement at that time and people want to be independent of it? And other constituencies, when you are looking at different countries and what they want to do, except in the East African country. That is historical for East Africa, isn't it? But I'm not sure. I did a lot of research work in Nairobi, Kenya, after the elections at that time. And what I saw was a new battleground. Yeah. So to me, it's just something which we need to look into seriously, but with a lot of caution with regard to the impact of those institutional changes if they derive us some benefit, or perhaps we should now go back and read, hey, why did they bluster? Why? Why the hell?
But Professor Marx,
Yes.
Don't you think this is really progressive for an organization of the continent to say, look, maybe it's time we should re-examine ourselves and see whether we need to make changes? And I suppose they were looking at the rationale d'entrée of the Organization of African Unity before, and the African Union. Do we need this organization? Do we need that? I mean, in the past, of course, people were moving around and making suggestions of one continental African government, and of course, you recall the Cairo disagreement between Nyerere and Nkrumah and all that. But this organization has survived, and now to get to a point to say, look, maybe we need to re-examine this in the contemporary Africa and its problems and development. Maybe it's the right thing. Do you share that, pessimism or whatever it is?
Well, I think it is worthwhile embarking on the project, but we must be very, very cautious by looking at the experiences of other countries in Europe and elsewhere, and what might befall the countries in Africa. Within Africa, probably this is to be a likely case, but then they haven't gone into there yet. To see the kind of shirt which Daudi Mkangara is putting on, and if I need it or I like it, perhaps I should rethink and say, well, yeah, let us look at what our colleagues have done elsewhere, and why is it just a country of groups that they are bringing in issues which we haven't really reflected upon? I like my Kenya, but I dislike it as well.
And you like your Tanzania?
Oh, but, Tanzania is me. I can't kill myself. But when it comes to, but definitely when it comes to his South.
Before I ask Richard to come in and let alone Bravier, let me go back again to Professor Maxim Moya. You know, not only in the discussion in this program, but elsewhere you read, you hear kind of a complaint that, the AU, or the OAU, this was a club of heads of state. They come for mutual administration, and that's all. No impact, nothing. But now they're saying, let us reform. Before you come in.
First of all, I think it was the wrong conclusion. I know it was a popular one. It was a popular kind of conclusion, and a lot of us, perhaps in our younger and more revolutionary days, supported that particular point of view and so on. But it is further from the truth, because these people also fought for self-determination, and they did it very well. I was reviewing that particular point actually yesterday, and I thought, actually the African states did not have much support in the world, except in some sense, and only in a limited sense, in the context of the Cold War, that the USA, for example, the one pole against the other, tended to stand with colonialists, the remaining colonialists, especially Portugal, Spain, but also, maybe a surprise, South Africa, and the others. So only the Soviet Union would come in on the other side in support of liberation. Okay. So you are looking at a situation in which you had many of these very powerful states not really supporting the agenda of liberation. What does this mean? It means actually the agenda of liberation was carried by African heads of state. Because if you look at Latin America, for example, the natural supporters of this, they too went through colonialism and so on, but they had their independence 150 years before. Okay, and they weren't terribly interested in this particular matter. So this is an example. I think that whereas they may have fallen short of what generally we expected them to accomplish, I don't think you can actually say that all they did was simply sit together in some kind of club and enjoy themselves.
Yeah. Well, that's the mistake many of us,
yes.
I suppose I must include myself, many of us either made or attributed to the thinking that this has become a club of head of state. Richard Mbunda, what's your take on this? I mean, you had Professor Max Moya, you have Professor Mukangara. The focus of the AU, at least at its 29th summit in Addis Ababa, do you think there's been a bit of a change? And if that change has brought some kind of renewed hope for Africa?
Well, I think there is, because if you look at the agenda, the main areas of which they discussed, you can see there is something new coming in. For example, they discussed very much about, the demographic changes, as they progress. Today, Africa has like 1.2 billion, but 2030 there will be 1.7, 2050 2.5, and 2100 they are going to be like, in Africa we are going to be like 4.4.
Yeah. And you are likely to be part of that demographic.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure by that year.
Not to me.
I'm not sure.
My two other colleagues. Okay.
But I think it is. It was an important subject of discussion because youth, as part of the African citizenry,
yes,
have always been marginalized. So bringing them into the debate,
yes, and
looking for ways like to empower them,
yes,
has been very important. It's one of the success issues that one can say can be attributed to this summit, the AU summit. But also, like giving a footnote to it, looking at basic details, representation. We are talking about 55 countries, African countries, forming the African Union.
And by the way,
yeah,
the 29th session,
yeah,
was, I suppose, the first time that all the member states,
yeah,
the number mentioned,
yeah, that's what I actually wanted to say. So actually, it was fully represented.
Yes.
All members were represented. So I think it is a plus because it shows, they value the summit. All the members wanted to participate, but also, it shows some commitment. Commitment has been one of the issues that have been raised in the Kagame report for institutional reforms, yes, that some of the African countries, are not very much committed to the African agenda. So I think by just attending, having, yes, a representation, yes, there is very important.
Okay. Brevis, you're representing the demographic dividend, I suppose.
Those who will be here until 2019.
Okay.
Thank you. I must admit that I'm very privileged to be having visiting Swedish academicians in this country. Secondly, as they have said, of course, it's not all doom and gloom about Africa in relation to the summit that has passed. But I would restate to say that that connotation you brought in about the club being meeting in Addis is over. I think it's still moving. Looking at what the report was saying in particular, the Kagame report, from the economic perspective. That's why I would like to dwell so much in. There are issues that were raised, in particular on the way the African countries are conducting their businesses, in particular on the economy and trade, and in particular to the reforms on how they can be supporting in terms of the African Union itself. And this is bringing me back to what Mwalimu said way back in 1965 in the National Assembly here, when he asked, do African states meet in conclave to mean what they say, or they just go
say
there they don't do? And he was in particular talking about the resolution that had been that was passed in before. It was 2nd December of 1965 about the Smith regime of breaking the diplomats with Great Britain, and decided if we didn't do that, then it was a total failure. And I think today the thing is still happening now and then. The question of these people meeting and addressing issues has been on and on and on and on. The question about the demographic dividends, the questions about the economies, we have seen a number of researches in this continent about how we can go about that. Look, when he proposed the 0.2% of the levies, yes. Lassana Ouattara was in support of it as one of the distinguished economists in this continent. The countries like Nigeria, South Africa, the big countries, are against that move. Some are blaming them, some are saying, they should be doing that. But let's go into the matters. The problem in this continent is that we have been awashed by this notion of the Africa rising, statements that have been raised by economists in 2011. And so everybody has been concentrating on the economic growth. So they're telling us the numbers, 7% growth, 8% growth. And well, it's a very good thing. But how do you integrate that economic growth with the social... How do you
interpret that growth
to social...
To the ordinary social
development. And that's where the question lies. They have not been able, till today, to have a critical discussion on it, but again, the critical implementations of these issues. Look, today, you talk about an African continent whereby looking at the nominal GDP, of course, you would say, yes, it's doing well. But when you go into the PPP of the purchasing power parity of the individuals within the continent, it's the worst continent on the planet. Why? It's because you have the policies. Instead of looking at the levies, of course, I don't support that even. I know that there were...
You don't support
I don't support the recommendation
of the 0.2%.
Yeah, I don't...
to imports?
Yes, despite that, there were people with a good experience, good knowledge, like Kaberuka. I would like, respectfully, not agree with what they had proposed, of course, on the levies. The question about Africa is not about the levies they want to take from the import they're bringing in the continent. The question is how the economy is integrated in the industrial process they are talking about. Two, that you talk about the way Africa itself does business. 15% the intra-trade, against 70 in Europe, against 26 in South America, against 52 in Northern America. If you are in that position, even if you take those levies, it won't do much. Number two is how we have been implementing our proposals.
That's number three.
No, number three, we have been implementing our proposals about development. You remember way back when we started the NEPAD thing.
Yes.
A lot of resolutions have been passed in Africa. Many countries have been supporting the move. But look at the implementation today. You find a lot of issues, for example, on the APRM, the African Peer Review Mechanism, that had a lot to do with the African continent. You will find very few countries have implemented what they agreed, and very few, in fact, have enacted what they have to do in the economies. Number two on that, on the thing, look at the Comprehensive Agricultural Development Program, the SSPD. They had said they want to reform the agricultural productivity as one of the pertinent issues in African economies. But as we speak today, less than 10 countries are allocating 10% of their budgets to agriculture, unlike other countries in the rest of the continent.
And incidentally, the chairman of the council of the OAU referred to that, and he raised his concern that famine is still a problem in Africa.
In Africa. And he said 20 million people are wallowing, or in fact, in socio-economic morass that are affecting them in terms of how they feed themselves. But there are no cries, at least in practicalities, to tame that problem. So they are there, of course, bringing resolutions, meeting and discussing and showing in the face value, of course. You say these are good movements, but I doubt to say that these are good movements. If I can talk a bit about peace and security, I think these professors will help us so much. But I think even on that, we have failed miserably, and I'm sorry to say that. Why? If you look at, for example, the architecture of the architecture of resolving these conflicts in Africa is too ambitious, but underfunded. They are always depending.
Peace and Security Council, which they established.
It's
not well funded.
It's not well funded. You can see if you talk about the AMISOM.
Strategies are not well designed.
Really, we have good examples. Look at AMISOM.
In Somalia,
60% of the funders are from outside. Look at Sahel. 60% from outside. Look at AFRISOM some years back in 2013 in Mali, 46% funded. So you'll see the whole issue on how we want to change this continent and the implications that are being drawn in their economies is very, very far from the realities. And I would like to conclude on this. If you talk of the constitution, I mean the institutions we're having, they are no more functioning. If we ask ourselves here, where is the African Bank? What does it do?
African Development Bank?
No, don't look at that. The African Central Bank.
Where is it? African Central
Banks? No. We introduced the African Central Bank, the likes of the European Central Bank. What does it do today? The African Investment Bank, what does it do today? Where are they? They have been replaced by the IMF, by the World Bank. It's not a very bad thing, of course, but it's very bad because it creates the necessity of Africa being dependent on those institutions.
I see Professor Max Muya is looking at me and he's looking at you, young man. You want to come in here? Has it rubbed you? Has it rubbed you?
I have my own questions which I want to raise. Simply the theories of mathematics, theories of cooperation, marriage, principles. What are they based on? They are based on differences, okay, but in order to support one another. Yeah. And what I see practically all through in sociological terms and political terms, and even the history of struggle for independence in these countries, it's only to the extent that A, B, C, they have things they share. And sharing is marginal because each one of them is focused on creating something for himself in the first instance, and perhaps create something on the basis of the weakness of the other.
Okay, an empire.
Yes, and that is my biggest worry, that perhaps the heads of states and ourselves, the academicians, we need to sit down. What's the basis of what you want to achieve? I don't see it there operationally taking place and even historically coming up anywhere, you know. I've done a lot of research work in the countries, and my colleagues, I'm sure they've done it, and traveled to Addis Ababa, where I've been teaching for 8 years, research methods. Research methods, 8 years, from different countries in Africa. When they meet there, then you find there are pockets of individuals from the different agencies. And when I was teaching, I was sometimes surprised. Are these the same people? Their unification, those students from all over, was only possible because they saw at the end of the game they'd be able to attain a position from studies, from whatever, but not coming together. You need to go to the theories, I think, of physics and whatever, and see how these things can come in, and perhaps go better, go further and say, well, where is Europe now, and why have they fragmented? So perhaps I think it is an important question for us that are joining in this game to say, was even independence in Tanzania jointly fought? Or it was couched and arrangements in a way that there'll be independence in quotes, but I'll be the head of government in the Union. In East Africa, our colleagues, I don't want to mention them, they might hear me and kill me, but they think it's straightforward. You know, they are there for a state.
Yeah, that observation by the two previous speakers is correct. It's more like you answer a question with a yes and a no. Like Professor Max Muya, you know, what he says is that the difficulty of sustainability, okay, of integration and then union, okay, that may be the underlying problem of the entire OAU first and now AU, okay, that is his thesis and so on. And he is most probably right. Okay. In relation to this reform that they are proposing, I think one of the things we might need to say is, yes, even with those difficulties, you can make an organization work a little better. I think that's the point that these leaders are talking about. Let's look at some of these things. I think our colleague here, Mbunda, said something about it. One of the very first points that the Kagame report makes is that there are too many things in which the AU is engaged. Okay, and I agree.
You mean no focus?
No focus, precisely, and he makes that point. They make that point, yes, no focus. So they actually use that word, focus. So say, focus on fewer matters, on fewer priorities. It has always been my forte to say to people, you know, what are the priorities? Nini kipaumbele in Kiswahili? And then when you ask people, usually they think of all things they like. And before you know it, they have about 50 priorities. Well, those cannot be priorities. No. Okay. And Africa, through our two organizations that followed each other, have had that. So I think it is good to think like this. You know, I listed them myself, the matters that the AU has been dealing with, and before them the OAU. Before I even looked at the Kagame report, and I was astounded. I said, how can you accomplish all this? And these are big things, as it were.
But okay. You're very right, because even at individual level, I mean, you have to be focused. I mean, first, the young man talked about the economy, which translates into the financial capability and all that. You can't have 100 things you want to accomplish, and when you look at the resources you have, you know, they don't compare.
So on that let's put it in perspective. A lot of issues in relation to what? If it's in relation of the resources, then a number of questions arise. As you talk today, Africa is losing over 150 billion a year on corruption. You talk of the budget you have said.
Yes.
It is 22 times higher, I mean smaller, than that amount you are losing on corruption. That's number one. We are losing 3.3% of the African GDP on listed financial flows, not illicit, the listed financial flows in the way we conduct our negotiations with the rest of, we call them development partners. Number three, you look at the way the taxes in African continent, the way they have been collected in terms of these resources we have from not only on the natural resources, but look at even on the commodities themselves. There are loopholes, in fact, economically speaking, that if we can bridge, you won't see these, we call them a big number of issues. I think we don't have a big number of issues in relation to resources. We have a big number of issues in relation to our responsibilities.
I'll mention some of them.
Professor, continue. I'm sorry to cut you short.
Oh, no, that's fine. That's how it should go.
Yes.
You know, many of these are actually not something the AU leaders decided to put on the agenda themselves. Let's review some of them. There's HIV/AIDS. They can't run away from that. They have to coordinate that.
TB.
Okay. They are undemocratic regimes. They have to deal with this.
Yes.
Okay. They have civil wars. That's separate from the one I just mentioned. Okay. Because you may have civil wars even where the issue of unconstitutional means of coming to power is not an issue. Okay. There is terrorism now. There wasn't much in the past. So now it
Internal, external, both.
well, both, I suppose. Yes. There are complex emergencies. Okay. Refugees, famine, even desertification. Sometimes floods.
Climate change.
Climate change, as it were. Okay. Some of these have now been resolved. The national colonial questions, for example. Okay. But there is still one in the Sahara, in Sahrawi, involving the Sahrawi Republic. Okay. There are border problems.
Yes.
We thought we had dealt with this. I mean, the very first pillar of OAU in 1963 was let borders be as we found them. Okay.
Before the division of Africa in 18.
No, after the colonialists
Okay.
left.
Yeah.
That was the
It's
point.
still bothering us.
It is still bothering us, of course.
Lake Nyasa or Lake Malawi.
Even in our own country, of course, there is a problem. Right now, as we are talking about, the leaders of the Peace Council of the AU,
Peace and Security
the
Council,
Peace and Security Council of the AU, were supposed to go to Eritrea because Eritrea has a border problem with Djibouti.
Okay.
They have even fought over that border problem.
Yes.
Somalia, only in its disorganized form at the moment, may not be claiming overtly the border with Ethiopia.
Puntland.
As far as they are concerned, that border, the western border of Somalia, has never been formalized.
Formalized, okay.
As it were. It's one of the reasons why they had clashes in the past. So you have border problems, and sometimes they can't run away from that.
How about ethnicity and issues like that?
Yes. I was linking that with simpler questions of civil wars that you get concerned with them at the continental level when they emerge into something bigger, such as a civil war. Otherwise, ethnicity itself as a problem is usually contained within
South Sudan
national.
A case study?
Yes.
In that aspect?
Yes. South Sudan would be a case study in that case. And then you also have issues that Kayoza usually is engaged in, economic issues.
Yes.
They have to deal with economic welfare. They have dealt with these issues for a long time. Okay. The Lagos Plan of Action 1980 was focusing on this. The Abuja Treaty of 1991, which brought in the RECs, okay, regional economic communities, and so on. And in terms of trying to uplift the standards of people in Africa, the standards of living, education, water, general growth.
Health.
Yes. Oh, health, of course. I had said that in relation to HIV pandemic. So there are a lot of questions. And I haven't even finished. As it were. I was just giving you an example.
Professor, if you can allow me, Professor,
yeah.
On the question, for example, of the undemocratic regimes and civil wars happening in Africa, I think this brings me back to the point Professor Moyo was saying. These are problems that are sometimes created to make these people who are telling us that they are leading this continent remain in power. look at the African ideology that comes in. It has taken many shapes from negritude to African personality. And always when questions are asked about these questions, they will come immediately and use this neo-colonialism, colonialism mantra that these people from Europe are doing this and that because they want to exploit us. But in reality, what they are doing in particular is not. And at times, you find some leaders in Africa using the Machiavellian ways of doing things. They use the barbaric ways of making themselves remain in power at one point, and they go to start blaming the subordinates like the police, that you police, you stop, brutal people. But they're using the same ways to remain there. And these cause conflicts in Africa. In the end, they come, they say, oh, we have this problem, we want to deal with this. On the other questions, let's go back to what has been happening. I think they know more than I know. There was an assessment of 2010 about moving Africa forward on the security issues, on peace and the right matters. These all issues were raised, recommendations were made, the achievements so far, the implementations so far are negligible. And these people are keeping on moving into meetings and meetings and meetings.
Or is it because of the poor institutional framework which should be implementing the decisions made by the heads of state?
I would agree with you.
One of the issues that was raised in the Kagame report for reform is precisely that there is actually a problem with the structure of the AU Commission. It was specific on the Commission, not the entire AU, but that is the implementing organs as such.
Kind of the secretariat.
Yes. Well, they mention, first of all, that it is top-heavy in bureaucracy. You have 8 commissioners, and plus the chairman and vice chairman, and 38 departments. So really top-heavy in terms of in terms of bureaucracy. But they're also calling for a greater division of labor. This I didn't understand really, and I have to look at it again. Greater division of labor between, they say, the AU and the regional economic communities and
State government.
Yeah, and states, yes, or other regional mechanisms and so on. Well, I have always felt that there is actually clear mandate among all these, and they haven't elaborated on this. But it seems that they are concerned with some kind of duplication that they see in these particular structures. They want the commission itself to be leaner, of course, eliminate bureaucratic red tape, and a few other things that they talk of.
Professor, I recall some time back, I lived in Addis Ababa.
Yeah.
Not working for the OAU, of course, but for the UN. And we interacted with colleagues from the UN, from the OAU, and most of them were complaining that the top-heavy positions we're talking about were being maintained by staff who come from countries which, if they are not behind their contribution, they haven't paid for several years. Why should they be there? So that maybe they should think of a country which pays, contributes regularly, should have a share on the table, but not otherwise.
Well, that itself may bring in another controversy, because I think that they have been moving, as in many important organizations at the world level, towards some kind of sharing among regional blocs, the sharing of these top positions.
What the UN calls quota system.
Yeah, the UN calls it a quota system. There is a quota system in the AU as well. It's not as well spelled out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, time as usual, my God, time is running out. Mbunda, you've been quiet for a while, although enjoying the discussions.
Yeah, it's been very enjoyable.
Do you think all what Professor Mukangara was raising and Professor Maximou, as well as Bravius, because the focus here is on the reform, and I think it was good that we zeroed down on the focus of the reform of the AU, because all these other aspects are part and parcel of a well-structured, well-reformed AU, peace and security, financial sustainability. Do you think, in the end, this will succeed to reform the AU?
Well, I think
on the basis of all the issues that Professor Mukangara said, there may be many, but we need to focus, as the Kagame report says. What do you think?
I think that's the most difficult question, whether the reform process will be successful. But what is important is that at least the African Union is doing like a self-assessment, because we are talking about these leaders, who actually at the end of the day are the one who can, give the political will of whether to implement the reforms or not.
In their own countries.
Yeah. So an important question. But I wanted to just chip in on what Professor Mukangara had said about, like the division of labor between the African Union and the other institutions, the RECs, regional economic integrations, and so on and so forth. If you read, I read Kagame's speech, and he gave an example of the Gambian crisis, where he said ECOWAS did a great job, and actually he thought maybe if all regional integrations can do the same,
remove a head of state
who
has been kicked out by the ballot box.
Yes. So he thought maybe under such circumstances, there's no need of having the African Union heavily involved, but only giving support in terms of maybe finance or whatever, any other support that will be needed.
I thought, I'm sorry to interrupt, I thought it would be something like that, and I disagree totally. Because, yes, because I think the mandate is quite clear.
Yeah.
The question of enforcement is of the Security Council. It's the United Nations Security Council. So that mandate is very clear. What has happened now, as of course, starting from chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter, which allows regional arrangements to help with the maintenance of international peace and security. Okay? What has happened is to extend this to sub-regional organizations. Okay? So that beyond, let's say, AU, so you can have ECOWAS.
Yes.
You can have the East African.
SADC.
Yes, well, the East African community, in terms of enforcement, they actually don't call it the East African community. So it's more like it's a standby force that they have, unlike in other areas.
Yes.
So usually, for example, the force we have in Congo, which consists of Tanzanian, Malawian, and South African forces. Okay. Now, many may think that this is something that was simply decided by the conference on the Great Lakes region. It's not the case. That they may have initiated that decision. It went to the AU. So the AU authorized it. And the AU also went to the United Nations Security Council. It was authorized over there.
Excellent. Professor, we have 5 minutes. Let's wind up. I wish I had more time. There are a number of questions, but it is always good to focus on something. As the Kagame report suggested that the AU should be more focused. We were more focused here. So we are implementing Kagame's report in our own way. I'll start with Professor Maximilian. Very quickly, we go round. So, are the challenges facing the AU a manifestation of the serious problems of development in its member states? Very quickly, Professor.
It is it's a big challenge. We need to think more. Yes, because there are more practical issues to be considered. And I think we need to sharpen the theoretical construct that is going to go to guide the independent countries to go this way and that way. The simple reason there is that these are organizations and unions which have been there together, ideally, because they had something together against them. When that is over, and then you see the differences. and you start fighting with your students, whatever. Teachings for us, we've been teaching outside, and we are no longer the same with the students. I think it's a good idea that we are at this point, and let us sit down and look at what areas really we can draw in the actual factors that made us go together against colonialism. It's not there now.
And using our own African experts.
Yeah, of course.
You can. Very quickly, a few seconds.
Yes, I think the challenges are enormous. We have to address them critically, not the way they do the fictitious reports now and then. I think we have to move from there. Number two, they have to iterate what they decide and what the masses really want to go in what direction. Remember, between 12th and 16th of February 1990, there was a conference here that was dubbed Putting the People First. It came with a charter of African participation in their own development. It has never been implemented, at least in practicalities, in the politics of these countries. I think that's where we have to start from, and we can make this content great, if I may borrow Trump's words.
Very quickly, Richard.
Well, for me, I think, well, it is actually a manifestation of what is happening in the, like member states. Not generally economic development, but political development. Because now we are talking about the question of governance, and we have people who are, like spearheading the reforms, Paul Kagame, and actually we heard a speech from President of Chad, Addis, Deby. This guy is in his fifth term, and his citizens are protesting, yes. And we are having Kagame, who was in power from 1994 to the present, and he's seeking a third term. Imagine, third term after more than 20 years. So basically, it is also, like a political question. Okay.
So it's being transferred to the...
Yeah, it's actually being transferred.
We need to put our houses in order first, I suppose. Yeah. So
before we propose the reforms.
Very quickly, Professor.
It's a great point, but I wouldn't say let's put our houses in order first. But it's a great point. I just, I applaud that. It's a great point that is talking about, because, the AU is going to perpetually deal with the question of unacceptable regimes because of the way they came into power, okay, and because of the way they sustain themselves. And an example has just been given over there.
Yeah, thank you very much. My panelists say thank you very much for your contribution. I'm sorry time is against us, but this is typical of this program. Very interesting discussion when you have eminent academicians, professors here, and the two young men who are also part of the academic. But you've done justice, frankly, to the topic of the 29th ordinary session of the heads of state. As my viewers, you've heard the views of my panelists here. The 29th ordinary session of the heads of state of African Union opened in Addis Ababa early this year. And as we said, it kind of brought a renewed sense of solidarity, as we heard from Richard here. Commitment, again, you heard from my panelists here, resolving major problems that face it. Some commentators and analysts have described the session, that's the 29th session, as progressive and focused, that's the word, focused, on major issues such as the reform of the AU, which was the focus of our discussion also here, financial matters to make it self-reliance, to work harder on peace and security of the continent, to work closer with the Union, with the United Nations, and stronger investment on youth, as the theme of the conference of the summit was, harnessing the demographic dividend through investment on the youth. And we are presented today by two youth here. I hope this theme will be interpreted more practical and effectively by the member states of the EU. The summit was also noted to have brought renewed hope and aspiration for the continent. Let us hope that the decisions made by the heads of state will be fully followed up and indeed implemented by the African Union Commission, given the needed financial resources. Well, you heard Bravias here hammer so much about the economy and all that. The 2017 budget of the AU, which stands at US dollars 782 million shillings, dollars, of course. Of this, 30% is received from the member states. However, the rest is from external donor sources, and the European Union has been referred specifically. Now, how can you expect the African Commission to implement all these decisions, including those that will emerge as a result of the reform, if the resources are not available? That's all we have for you today. Until next Sunday at the same time, and on Thursday at 15 hours for the repeat program. On behalf of my panel, Richard Mbunda, Professor Daudi Mukangara, Professor Maxim Muya, Bravias Kahoza, and my TBC television crew, thank you, viewers, and goodbye.